was taken to meet infinite love. He asked me, what is the greatest thing in the world? Are you curious about how these mystical experiences and visions can apply to your journey? The New Testament is hid in the Old Testament, and the old is manifested in the new. And there is a part of you that has this understanding. There is a version of you that already has achieved. By the end of this video, I trust that you will find that you have a deeper understanding of the promise, which is Neville Goddard's experience of spiritual rebirth. This experience talks to man's experience that each one of us will ultimately have in terms of this birth from above. As I read, study, and apply Neville's teachings, and I help my clients do the same in terms of their growth and transformation, I inevitably will do much more research than whatever the material is on hand for me. In this chapter, The Promise, Neville's first mystical vision takes place not after 1959, but in fact, it happens 30 years prior. I was so excited to actually fully understand what that first mystical experience that Neville alludes to in terms of the Divine Society. So if you want to know more, definitely watch this video, because I'm going to bring in the other lectures that Neville actually spoke more in detail about the promise. Neville gave many lectures, and I think there were approximately 300, if not more. Those lectures often lend depth and understanding to the things that he's touched on in his books. Welcome back, and if you're new to this channel, hi, I'm Fazila Bijo. I'm here to help you explore, understand, and navigate the depths of spirituality and consciousness. As I've mentioned, studying this chapter, I started to explore other parts of Neville's teachings that are contained in his lectures. And as I was doing this, I uncovered many deeper layers in terms of his mystical visions and experiences in terms of spiritual rebirth. And I'm going to try and keep it simple. There's so much to actually take in terms of all of this. And you may not know this about me. In my own journey, I've always wanted to know what else is available, what more is that we can actually understand about ourselves as these human and spiritual beings. If you're here on this channel, I'm pretty sure that you too have found sometimes Neville's teachings can be elusive, especially when he talks about the promise. This is why in this video, I will be breaking down these mystical experiences and making sense of these insights that can help you around spiritual awakening as far as I can possibly do this in this current state of consciousness. And I preface this because each time that I research, I study, and I apply Neville's teachings, my consciousness is forever expanding. So take it from me in terms of where things are at now, that I too am learning every time. From my perspective, in terms of where I'm at, I have not experienced the promise yet. I know it's unfolding within me, but like Neville, William Blake, and others who have experienced the promise, left these spiritual teachings for us so that we may know that, number one, it is possible. Once one person in consciousness achieves a certain goal, achieves a certain breakthrough, we know it is possible for the rest of humanity as well. All we need to do is choose it. And that's what this whole spiritual experience is about. Even if you don't choose it, it will still unfold. The spiritual rebirth still happens. When it will happen, how it will happen, it is not known. However, if you make it, knowing that our consciousness creates our reality, if you choose to actually have the spiritual rebirth from above, I believe my personal perspective is that you will create this reality because it becomes something that, number one, you have chosen. And the second thing is, the more your focused attention is on experiencing the spiritual rebirth from above, the more you become that version, the more you align to that version of yourself who has experienced it. Because there is a part of you that has this understanding, and it is for you to actually choose it as well. There is a version of you that already has achieved the promise. You are curious, and if you are like me, you are on this path in terms of experiencing the spiritual rebirth and knowing that you truly are the operant power of the law and you are the creator of your reality. What do you understand by the promise? And remember, this is just it's an unfolding within. It may start out as an intellectual endeavor, but you'll go from simply knowing of it to knowing it to embodiment. And this is what Neville has left for us as a practical guide as well in his lectures and his books. Up until now, watching the series on the law and the promise, what is your understanding of the promise? Now, at first, it is going to feel like an intellectual endeavor, an intellectual exercise. But the more you ponder on it, the more you can open, the more you put the query into your subconscious, so that the subconscious can start to actually percolate and allow the awareness to allow consciousness to meet itself. I don't need to tell you this. The reason I do these videos is because I am intrigued. I am forever looking at how I can elevate my consciousness and awareness so that I can be more deliberate, more conscious, and expand in terms of my awareness. In terms of the promise, as a recap, we spoke about God dies and God has freely given himself for man so that man may have this experience of God. And this story is simply the discovery of the fatherhood of God. We'll hear about how Neville talks about the spiritual rebirth from above. God is buried within the skull, and how this spiritual rebirth takes place from within man's skull. Some may actually liken this to a Kundalini awakening in terms of the energetic spine, but it's not that. This is about God awakening within man, the consciousness, imagination, creator, the power of imagination, the power of creation that awakens within is our subconsciousness that has been sleeping. So God's play, which transforms man into God, is revealed in the Bible. The Bible was never intended to teach history, but rather to help us be led through faith, through any obstacles and challenges and problems that we may be facing, to understand that those problems are not real. What lies outside of us is simply a projection of our inner consciousness. And as we raise as consciousness is raised, to experience the resurrection of God within. Where God has been sleeping, the Bible is a psychological drama that shows us the journey of God going to sleep as man and awakening to be resurrected and have the inner Christ consciousness become awake. In addition to this, Neville says the New Testament is hid in the Old Testament, and the Old is manifested in the New. So the Old Testament tells us of God's promise. The New Testament tells us not how this promise was fulfilled, but how it is fulfilled. What Neville is speaking about here is, he says, with the story of Adam going to sleep, where Adam is created in the image of God, man is created in the image of God, God goes to sleep, and the psychological drama is that at each stage, each character represents a state of consciousness. As the Old Testament is the crucifixion, the New Testament is the resurrection and the fulfillment of the promise. So Neville says, here is my experience of this birth from above. It came through the actual mystical experience from being born from above. He says none can speak of this truly mystical birth from above, but only one who has experienced it. He explains that the personal mystical experience of the birth of oneself out of one's own skull, so where consciousness is sleeping, is symbolized in the birth of a child, wrapped in swaddling clothes and lying on the floor. Now we see that this is very similar to that story of the birth of the Christ. And here he says, I had no idea that this birth from above was literally true. In this chapter, Neville talks about one of his most powerful experiences where he was taken in spirit to what he calls a divine society. What didn't make sense to me at the time when I read this chapter was that this mystical vision took place some 30 years prior to Neville achieving the full mystical vision of the promise. And this for me was quite interesting because I could not understand how it all fit together. In this chapter, he says, many years ago, I was taken in spirit into a divine society, a society of men in whom God is awake. Now, that was around 30 years prior. He said he encountered infinite love and might. And these were not just concepts, but they were states personified as men. So if you had to take, as an example, Moses is a state, which is to be born again, personified as a man for the purposes of storytelling. These states were personified as men, given names, so that consciousness at the time could actually understand what the story was about. And so for where consciousness was at the time, storytelling was very powerful. And so it was deemed to be a better way to express the story. Now, Neville said, in this moment, though it may seem strange, the gods do truly meet. What he's talking about is at the Divine Society, he encounters infinite love and might. These weren't just concepts, but states personified as men. And this is where we start to see now the Bible itself. All of these characters are personifications of a state given a name. He said, in this mystical experience, at that moment, he could feel infinite might was only about power. But when he fused with infinite love, with his very being, he was united with the essence of the divine. And he goes on to say then that a voice then commands him to share this promise with the world, the promise that we are all destined to experience the spiritual rebirth, this unification with the essence of the divine, which is love. I want to read out just part of Neville's experience in his words. I was taken to meet infinite love. He asked me, what is the greatest thing in the world? I answered him in the words of Paul, faith, hope, and love. These three. But the greatest of these is love. At that moment, he embraced me and our bodies fused and became as one body. I was knit to him and loved him as my own soul. This is about oneness, unity, and consciousness. The words love of God, so often a mere phrase, were now a reality with a tremendous meaning. He says nothing ever imagined by man could be compared with this love, which man feels through his union with love. The most intimate relationship on earth is like living in separate cells compared with this union. He goes on, in terms of his experience, he says, it might looked into my eyes, and without the use of words, Neville here says, time to act. I was suddenly whisked out of that divine society and returned to earth. I was tormented by my limitations of understanding. But I knew that on that day, the divine society had chosen me as a companion and sent me to preach Christ, God's promise to man. And this is the unfolding. What we experience is the unfolding of the promise within each of us. How and when that is to happen, we do not know. It will happen when we truly, truly want to choose this experience of God within. Neville alludes to this and he says, when you choose to have this experience of God, when you truly desire it above everything else, you have this burning hunger that nothing else will satisfy you, is when you will experience it. Now, before explaining what he experienced that night, Neville emphasizes that he does not want to impose his ideas, but through talking about what his experiences are, he wants to give hope. In the first mystical vision that he has in 1959 on July 20th, he talks about his experiences and he says, I do so not to impose my ideas on others, but that I may give hope to those who, like Nicodemus, this is a character in the Bible, wondered, how can a man be born when he is old? And another of his questions to Jesus, how can he enter a second time into his mother's womb and be born? How can this be? Those who, he says, like Nicodemus in the Bible, who had lots of questions for Jesus about what would it be like to have this physical birth again? How can a man who is old have a rebirth? Does it mean that he's got to go back into his mother's womb? And that's what Neville says. As Nicodemus actually question Christ, and he wants to help humanity understand how the spiritual rebirth happens, having experienced it himself. It says, in the early hours of the morning on July 20th, 1959, in the city of San Francisco, he was having a heavenly dream in which the arts flourished, but he was suddenly interrupted by the most intense vibration centered in the base of his skull. Then a drama as real as those that I experience when I am fully awake began to unfold. I awoke from a dream to find myself completely entombed within my skull. I tried to force my way out through its base, and something gave way. I felt myself move head downward through the base of my skull, and I squeezed myself out inch by inch. When I was almost out, I held what I took to be the foot of the bed and pulled the remaining portion of me out of my skull. And there on the floor, I lay for a few seconds. He's witnessing the birth through his skull, but he's having the experience of the rebirth through his skull. Still continuing with the first mystical vision here, then I rose and I looked at my body on the bed. It was pale of face, lying on its back, tossing from side to side like one in recovery from a great ordeal. As I contemplated, hoping that it would not fall off the bed, he talked about his body, I became aware that the vibration which started the whole drama was not only in my head, but was also coming from a corner in the room. As I looked to that corner, I wondered if that vibration could be caused by a very high wind, a wind strong enough to vibrate the window. I did not realize that the vibration which I still felt within my head was related to that which seemed to be coming from the corner of the room. Looking back to the bed, I discovered that my body was gone, but in its place sat my 3 older brothers. My oldest brother sat where the head was. My second and third brothers sat where the feet were. None seemed to be aware of me, although I was aware of them and could discern their thoughts. I suddenly became aware of the reality of my own invisibility. I noticed that they too were disturbed by the vibration coming from that corner of the room. My third brother, who was the most disturbed, and went over to investigate the cause of the disturbance. His attention was attracted by something on the floor, and looking down, he announced, "It's Neville's baby." My other 2 brothers, in most incredulous voices, asked, "How can Neville have a baby?" My brother lifted the infant wrapped in swaddling clothes and laid him on the bed. I, then with my invisible hands, lifted the babe and asked him, "How is my sweetheart?" I looked into his eyes and smiled, and I awoke in this world to ponder this greatest of my many mystical experiences. I believe that Neville gave us an account of this experience so that, number one, hearing what someone else has actually experienced help us navigate through an experience like this when it does come up for us. So bearing in mind that this is a very, very spiritual and mystical experience, and one that can actually, if you're not prepared for it, it can leave one very much in fear and uncertainty. I know from my own experiences, shamanic journeying, having participated in an ayahuasca ceremony years ago, I fully understand what it's like to not be prepared to have these expansive, sometimes frightening, sometimes overwhelming experiences. This for me speaks to Neville actually achieving those levels of consciousness without inducing experiences. Help me understand what Neville is talking about, where one has an intense spiritual experience that you can actually be left feeling ungrounded. But I believe that when one is in alignment and experiences the promise, that rather than being overwhelming or frightening, as we see here, Neville realized that he was the baby and that he had now had the spiritual rebirth. So mystical vision 2, he says, 2 other visions I will tell you because they bear out the truth of my assertion that the Bible is mystical fact, that everything written about the promised child in the law of Moses and the prophets and the Psalms must be mystically experienced in the imagination of the individual. The child's birth is a sign and a portent and signals the resurrection of David, the Lord's anointed, of whom he said, "You are my son. Today I have begotten you." Neville recounts an even more symbolic moment, the vivid experience of giving birth to himself in July from within his own skull. There was a sudden explosion, and I found myself in a modestly furnished room. Again, he speaks about that powerful moment when his skull was split by a lightning bolt, which symbolizes the crucifixion. A serpentine energy rose from his being, and this represents the awakening of the divine consciousness within. He says, "Not for one moment did I feel myself to be anyone other than who I am now. Yet I knew this lad, David, who was my son, and I knew that I was his father. For the wisdom from above is without uncertainty." This is what Neville goes into a bit more detail in his lecture, The Morning Star. And this is what it means in terms of David being your son. Only when David stands before you, and he doesn't have to say a word, and he stands before you as though memory returns. As you look at him, this relationship of father-son is beyond all doubt. There is no doubt in your mind as to who he is. At that moment, memory returns, and the whole thing is so clear, as though in the beginning you knew it and deliberately went to sleep in the forgetfulness of the eternal Son that is your son. But you will not find David until the very end. And when you find him, he called you Father. And David is the Son of God. David is the symbol of humanity and all of its generations fused together. It comes out personified as the eternal youth called David. So they're leaning against the side of an open door was my son David of biblical fame. So what Neville says here is that he knew within himself that he was witnessing David, seeing the beauty of humanity. This is what David represents. Now, to know that David is his son means that Neville is now his father. Neville, having experienced the rebirth from above those 5 months prior, realizes now that he's actually come into divine union with God. Mystical Vision 3, on the morning of April 8th, 1960, 4 months after it was revealed to me that I am David's father, Neville experiences a lightning bolt that splits his skull open, followed by the rising of that serpentine energy from within. He connects this experience to the crucifixion of Jesus, not as a historical event, but it is a mystical one. This is an experience that fulfills scripture within the individual. I was cleft as though I were a tree that had been struck by lightning. Then I felt and saw myself as a golden light moving up my spine in a serpentine motion. As I entered my skull, I vibrated like an earthquake. These mystical experiences help to rescue the Bible from being something external in terms of history, persons, and events, to restoring it to its real significance in the life of man, so that we may understand that the Bible promises that Scripture is unfolding within us. The psychological drama of man from Adam through to Christ is the journey we take in the spiritual awakening. This is still maturing. The promise is still maturing to its time within every individual at each level and in its own time. Neville says every vision has its appointed hour. And so we will not know when, we will not know how. We are only to make the choice to have that experience. There will be many trials. No one can tell how much, how many, or how long. But you will experience this unfolding of scripture where when you see David in your experience and you know that you are David's father. You are God. You have unified with infinite love. You have come into the unification with infinite love. You will know then that this is this is scripture that has been fulfilled within you. This is God's promise that has now been fulfilled. So wait, for there will be no postponement. Everything happens at its appointed hour. And so, is anything too wonderful for the Lord? At the appointed time, I will return to you in the spring, and Sarah shall have a son. When I chose to do the series on the law and the promise, I knew it was going to be expansive for me. Each week that I studied and I put together the videos, I've had so much more. There's been so much that I've learned through this. I would love to hear what it's been like for you. So as I've gathered research from the different lectures that I looked through in order to bring together these last two videos, I will do future videos to help you understand how multi-layered these teachings really are. If there's a topic that you'd love for me to cover, please be sure to drop those in the comments below. Thank you for having joined me through the series and in this video. Be sure to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful content that I bring through in terms of spirituality, consciousness, and awakening. I'll see you in the next video.